Hello, everybody, and welcome. So happy to have you all here today. Welcome to the third workshop of our Urban Furniture Design Competition workshop series. This one, we're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the design and construction industry. We are really hoping that this is a great opportunity for those that are participating in the competition, whether they be students or working professionals themselves, to really consider how we are aligning diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do. Our work with this competition has been centered around that, and we'll get into that a little bit during this presentation. I want to thank some of our partners for this project, including the Design Build Institute of America, the Glen Park Neighborhood Association, Tarrant County College, Kimley Horn. So thank you all for sponsoring and being a part of this process. Oh, and Trinity Metro, excuse me, of course, Trinity Metro. So this video is that we will be showing, we actually recorded this last week during the snowpocalypse. And so I want to take a moment to thank Greg and Scott and Sadie and Dee for fighting the weather and lack of electricity and in and out internet and busted pipes and everything that was going on last week, to take some time for us to have a conversation around this really important issue. So this part was actually pre-recorded, and at the end we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer section. However, if you have questions while you are watching the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. And you can write those out and we can either answer, we can type it in and answer then. We can also have that live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After that part of the presentation and after the Q&A, we will then go into some of the nuts and bolts of the actual competition itself, in which case we can then answer more questions. But while we are here, we have a few people on the call today that are some of our speakers. So I'd love for everyone to just take a moment to introduce themselves. Let's see here. And I'm going to have Scott, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hey, my name is Scott Boone. I'm in Austin, Texas. I work as a transportation consultant for Cambridge Systematics and done a lot of work up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Denton County, Tarrant County. Currently working on a Tarrant County transit study, so happy to be here.
Thanks, Scott. How about Greg?
Hi, I'm Greg Ibañez. I'm an architect in Fort Worth, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this.
Greg, really happy to have you here. Sadie Murray is next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Sadie. I'm the chair of the Ridership Committee here at Tarrant Transit Alliance, and I'm born and raised in Fort Worth and the community organizer here.
Thanks, Sadie. And last we have Raquel Ibarra. See, Raquel might be having some connectivity issues. So Raquel is actually going to be one of the folks that our competitors are able to connect with for this competition. So if you have questions about your design or construction and need a professional opinion, Raquel will be here to give you some more information. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hop into the pre-recorded session. Again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them at the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and let's get started. Oh, 1 moment. Having some technical difficulties, folks.
My name is Scott Boone. I work for a small transportation consulting firm. I live in Austin, Texas, and spend most of my time working on public transit products and projects. A lot of time is spent in market analysis, which is basically just understand who's riding the bus, who's not riding the bus, why are they not riding the bus, how can we make the bus more accessible, how can we more reflect the trips that people like to make instead of trying to build their lives around making 3 transfers across a county line. It's an exciting world. There's a lot of really interesting and innovative products. Sometimes innovation is used as just wrapping paper over a strange public-private partnership. Other times it means ways that can really transform the way that people can move around the city. So I like my job.
Tell me about your where did you go to school? What's your degree?
Oh, sure. I went to school in North Carolina, undergrad in math, which was fairly useless, and then the University of North Carolina for environmental engineering and urban planning. Started out in air quality, and then I thought that buses were more fun. So,
I'm an architect. I went to architecture school at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Graduated in 1980, so I am older than all you combined. Maybe you all look so young. And I have generally lived in Texas for that time. On graduation, I worked for a New York firm, but they sent me to Dallas for a project, and I thought would be about 3 years. And that been a little longer than that. I've lived in Fort Worth for now 23 years. I have a partner in our firm, Ibañez-Shaw Architecture. We're a small design boutique type firm. Boutique's a nice way of saying we're small. And we're based right on the edge of downtown Fort Worth.
Greg, I think you just need a green knit cap.
Green knit cap, yeah. I know I've got a gray one that's kind of permanent right now, but yeah. I know I was looking for my knit cap this weather. I was walking, I couldn't find it. But yeah, I love what I do. I've very involved in the profession. I've at the local and state level with the Texas Society of Architects and the American Institute of Architects, and consider myself very lucky. I'm always happy when I walk into the office every day, no matter, it's not all fun, but like any job, but it's still, I consider myself very lucky to how much I do enjoy what I do.
When I'm thinking about the accessibility of our project and trying to have a community-based approach, that's some of our highest priorities in this design. And so from a design perspective, before these things ever take shape in your work, how much say and control do you tend to have in the design of your projects? Greg, as an architect, when you're designing something, how much control do you have in the outcome of the design? Who gets to make those final calls?
Well, it's a good question. It's complicated. Can we say that? Charles Eames said that, what is design? Design is a response to a need. And if you think about design that way, I think that's the best way. All design has constraints. So there's time, budget, feasibility, etc. So how much control do we have? The control is always within potentially very narrow parameters. Money, function, of course, goes without saying. So how much control, it really depends on the project. Still waiting. I've only been doing this for 40 years. So maybe someday I'll have the client that just says time and money is no object. Hasn't happened yet. I'm still hopeful, but it's a collaborative process. And of course, it's a heavily regulated industry. So there's building codes, Americans with Disabilities Act, energy codes, many things that influence the built environment. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but maybe I've talked around it a little bit.
I think you definitely addressed the question. I've learned so much about just how complicated all these different relationships and collaborations can be in the design build industry. And specifically with transit, there is a lot of, especially with that funding, there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. And so when I think about it in terms of our project, which as a community group organizing this, the vision is that might give us some more flexibility with our design that from a bureaucratic approach isn't always as accessible. So, and considering that, and Scott, speaking to transportation specifically, how much does the community that you want to bring into that design space, how much do they get to participate in the design process, kind of the intended audience of a design or the intended users of a design? How much do those people get to be involved in the process?
So it's a good question. And I work for a transportation planning firm, so we do very little that involves, concrete. But the ways that we are involved, certainly the location, and certainly the level of, we would probably use a term like amenities or something, but really, it's the elements. And so I wouldn't have a lot of input, and certainly the community might have a few different levers to pull, but which bench gets selected. But from my point of view, a lot of the conversation revolves around not so much what does the shelter look like, but does the stop have a shelter? Does the stop have bike access? Does the stop have whatever level of comfort that's appropriate? And a lot of times the community's role in that is really advocating for themselves, both to have that level of investment in those amenities in a general sense, and also very specifically in their neighborhood. Neighborhood community groups have a huge amount of influence over where those resources get allocated. And it's good when that community has a voice, but that process can really work against a community that doesn't have the organization or representation that some others do around town, for sure.
Yeah, I think the design of, a transit, let's say shelter, as opposed to a bench or furniture, there are a number of issues. Shade is probably
huge.
I don't know what you think. That in Texas.
If I had to pick one thing other than a literal sign, then the shade is literally the difference between life and death, for sure.
Right. That is, the sun is the biggest determinant of design in our work. We don't have mountains here. We don't have oceans, but we have a lot of sun, too much sun. And, waiting for a bus on a August afternoon, it's brutal. It's just, it's unhealthy without shade. So that's always a critical item.
Yeah, you mentioned before the bureaucracy, and that's, when I think of bureaucracy, I think of the difficulty of getting something done, within an organization. And you also mentioned the word partnerships. And you really have a lot of, sometimes it is just red tape, but sometimes there's opposing desires within communities. We could talk for an hour about hostile architecture and, what it means to have furniture that serves one purpose while trying to serve another purpose and ends up not serving any purpose at all. So there's, when it comes to funding things, maintaining things, it's not just, usually the cheapest part of installing furniture is installing it in the ground. It's really when you're talking about years and years and years of maintenance, trash collection, et cetera. So yeah, the partnerships are really important, for sure.
I think historically, it's interesting in, let's say, I don't know if it's University Park or Highland Park, but on Mockingbird Lane in Dallas, there are a series of beautiful, ornate brick, terracotta roof, basically transit stations that I don't think was a streetcar then, but they had a real nobility. Now, the reality was it was probably the maids that were waiting there, that were working in those homes. It's a very affluent area. We've experienced, I mean, we're not transit experts, but I have experienced a neighborhood that, an affluent neighborhood that has fought transit stations. And I'm sure you've all heard that. You know, it's like, okay, well, we know the bus has to come through here. We just don't want people, you know, we don't want to make it easy. We don't want them hanging out. And then you have communities like this that are just begging for shelter and a little bit of grace in their everyday life. It just seems so far below the minimum we should be providing as a society to people. It's almost, it just seems absurd to even be discussing it. But here we are.
Yeah,
so, yeah, I mean, input, we've been involved in the last few years in several projects in highly underserved minority communities. One of them was a master plan for a teaching kitchen and farmers market in what was one of the largest food deserts in the United States in Macon, Georgia. And we had a whole series of public meetings for that. And it was, you know, we're architects and we have all these, you know, noble ideas about, well, it'd be this and it'd be that. And the people to me were like, can we have a roof? Will it have a roof? I mean, they're just, you know, they're so beat down from being ignored. And, you know, that what they're asking is just simple. It's things that most of us take for granted. And we did an aquatic center in Southeast Dallas, which is also one of the poor zip codes in Dallas County. And it was the same thing. We had public meetings. It was just like, you're designing a pool for us, for our neighborhood. We're going to have a pool. I mean, you know, they didn't care what color it was. I mean, not that they didn't care, but they're, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're not getting to the aesthetics. They just want the function. So it's really a challenge, and you know, I think we all agree we all need.
And also the inverse to be true, that if you're spending a lot of time talking about the aesthetics of it, it's usually the root of a bad faith argument against the transit facility to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Not that aesthetics don't matter, but it's whenever that conversation fills up the whole space in the room, you're usually actually not talking about the terracotta versus slate discussion.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's tragic that the conversation of accessibility when it comes to transit so often does get broken down into these really, really basic fundamental protections like shade from the sun, or is there a sidewalk? And is there a place to sit? And if there's a place to sit, can I move there if I'm traveling with a walker or with a stroller or in a wheelchair? You know, these are all just the very basics of accessibility, but there's also accessibility in terms of a sense of belonging, whether that's for the language that you speak, or financial accessibility, you know, catching a $2 bus in a neighborhood where you can't afford to shop. There's a certain feel to that. There's cultural and social access. Maybe this beautiful thing pops up, but because the conversation of aesthetics, the community didn't even know how to participate in that conversation. This design is something beautiful that doesn't maybe make sense to the people who live there because they don't resonate with that type of design. So I wonder, what do those public meetings look like? Because in my experience, when there's public meetings about an issue, sometimes it's more of like this, not necessarily a legal protection, but a good faith protection of like, here, we held these meetings, but how do you encourage attendance to those meetings or involvement, especially for kind of a targeted audience? Because you might have the affluent landowners there saying, no, we don't want this, not realizing that 1,000 people catch the bus out front of their business.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the vast majority of public engagement is there because it was mandated to, which is good. It should be mandated, but it's really easy to kind of lull yourself into thinking, oh, we held a public meeting, therefore this project has the support of the community. And so, yeah, being really intentional about breaking down barriers, if they're time, if it's money, if it's childcare. And we found that, frankly, the whole Zoom public meeting thing has really changed that process, I think, for the better. So I'm really excited to, now that everybody's kind of got, or not everybody, but lots of folks have been educated about how these tools are used, hopefully that will improve access to a lot of folks, but it won't fix the problem for everybody. And you'll always, I think part of the advantage of Zoom is it allows really strong moderation, which a person who can moderate a public meeting is a gifted and talented person who, deserves every penny they're paid. It's not something that everyone can do. And that's a big part of my job, is realizing where my abilities, to serve in that role end, and making sure that we get the right people to serve that role. And usually that's somebody from the community who knows on a much deeper level what those barriers are. So.
Well, and it is true that the, childcare is a big issue when you have a public meeting. Is the public meeting timed where, dual income families cannot attend? It just goes round and round. When I was chair of Fort Worth Public Art, obviously that's a highly engaged process, and with a really super committed staff. And having strong community leadership involved really helps drive it. And we found that in other projects as well. If you have recognizable community leaders that you can engage in the process, it builds trust. They can help lead the process. There's a lot of, I don't know if suspicion's the right word, but, people are a little wary of great things promised or might happen. And also, in public meetings, when my experience on some public commissions, you also have some people that are, I don't know, the term is gadflies, that show up at every public meeting. And, at first it's like, okay, these people are really engaged. I mean, it's like a hobby. And so there is some filtering that needs to happen. Are you really hearing what the community wants? Or are you hearing what the loudest people want? It's an art. I admire people that can do it. It's very hard, very hard.
I think, I mentioned, using other public engagement specialists, but I think that's where, and if you get a really good city council member or a really good person on staff at a public agency who just really lives in that purpose, to be the person who links the community to these projects, nothing can replace that. And when it's bad, it's very bad. And when it's good, it's really nice to see.
In terms of some of those barriers to community access, you've both mentioned childcare as a primary one, which I can identify with. Or are there other barriers that are really recurring?
Yeah, I find I don't really want to make this explicitly about renting versus home ownership, but it takes a period of time to learn what the levers of power are in a community. And if you've arrived recently and don't have, access to a neighborhood association, that can be really difficult. Language, which you mentioned, is absolutely huge. And it's not even just, oh, do you speak Spanish at home? A lot of it is that these meetings can very easily fall into very technical discussions that are not accessible even to people who speak English as a first language. That one comes up all the time. It's really hard, especially when you're talking about transit. When you're talking about transit, it's really easy to fall into this trap where you're just looking at where people live, and all you're doing is looking at the census, and that's where somebody's house is, therefore that's what gets used here. But that's where you run into a situation just like Greg described on Mockingbird Lane, right? And I think a large variety of people probably use transit facilities there, but if you're only asking the people who live there, you're missing a huge swath of the people that are really involved in this project and stand to benefit or lose the benefit from it. So that kind of front yard bias is really big too. I'm sure there are more.
Thank you so much for diving deep. This is really great conversation. In terms of our project and transit in Tarrant County in general, the biggest restriction, as you can imagine, is the budget. A very small budget, both for this project and for Trinity Metro in the city of Fort Worth. Arlington's got a budget of around $0 for public transportation. So with I just don't know their actual budgetary, but I know they have been, speaking of opponents to public transit, Arlington has quite a few around in the county. So anyway, with limited resources, how do you design with dignity a transit system, or any kind of design or build?
To me, we've seen, well, I don't want to make broad generalizations, but in Texas, we seem to undervalue the public realm. The public realm is basically what's left over from the private, what they don't want to use. A vacant lot's a park. Many neighborhoods in the city have no sidewalks, and they're not mandated, many of them. And in fact, they fight sidewalks because, believe it or not, they think it causes crime. And I've heard this in public meetings a number of times. Why do we need sidewalks? Anyway, so the public transit is part of the public realm. And the public realm is what we, the world's greatest democracy, self-described, the world's richest country, certainly. We should do things that endure. And what amazes me is, people travel and they go to, Union Station in DC, or if you've ever been to London, to St. Pancras Station, it's a train station. I mean, these are amazing places. Tourists go there and gawk and take photographs. But here, it's sort of a dingy thing that, you don't really want to sit or touch. And the lack of investment, and particularly maintenance, is sort of a form of, that form of neglect that then makes it a disagreeable thing to deal with for people. And so then therefore only people who have no choice deal with it. Scott can speak to this much more intelligently, but we're an extremely low density urban area. And transit seems to be treated a little better in higher density places. So there's just a lot of want to, and we've all heard this, this canard that, yeah, but we lose money on every rider on public transit. Well, we have a gas tax that's paying for the roads. We subsidize the building of subdivisions out on green fields. We build highways to them. We extend our water lines and our sewer lines. Yeah, it's a service, but they keep scored differently on public transit, and it's frustrating. It's I think, and not to digress, but maybe some of you are familiar with Steer Fort Worth, and I'm speaking this totally from memory, but I think a few years ago they did a big survey of like college graduates, people that you would want to move to Fort Worth, of like what were they looking for in the city, and apparently mass transit, it was like bike infrastructure and mass transit were like two of the top things. And there's obviously people at Trinity Metro are trying, but it's just it's falling on deaf ears apparently. And I don't, anyway, just my take, which I stand to be corrected on that.
No, paying for stuff is really hard. And I do really want to emphasize that we always say that capital is easy, operating is hard, which maybe is a little wonky, but building something is much easier than keeping it in good shape. When you talk about neglect, I mean, that's, a broken sidewalk in some cases is worse than just dirt. But if I were in a situation where I was in a neighborhood and trying to advocate for infrastructure, you need to find a champion that knows the process, and ideally that person can find at least there's grants. Sometimes just getting on a priority list and just annoying the person at Public Works, but somebody somewhere has a spreadsheet with something at the bottom and something at the top and a lot in between. And so really just moving your pet project up that list is an art form. And once it gets built, then you got to find somebody who's going to take care of it. Fortunately, most folks at transit agencies do realize how much of a burden that is and are pretty intentional about keeping those books in good shape. But yeah, just getting that foot in the door, finding that champion, finding that source of money, getting it built. It seems like it's the hard part at first, but it really, at the end of the day is I guess easier than the second part. Maybe that's discouraging. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you say that. In the architecture world, we call that the edifice complex, and that you can get, for nonprofits and institutions, you can get money to build things because it has a naming opportunity. Nobody names the air conditioning bill. Nobody names the the janitorial bill. The janitor is brought to you by Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. I mean, and on the nonprofit boards that I've been on, the funding is all set up for basically capital improvement by and large. It's not 100% true, but by and large, it's very biased towards capital projects. It's kind of taking care of it, you're on your own. Now, there may be some sense to that, but it's certainly, you're right. We see a lot of things built, and there's examples of this all over, of grand public buildings that have been built and that really struggle with maintenance. It's quite a common thing.
To your point, it's much easier to get one real, and I'm not really exaggerating at all here, $1 million bus stop built than $1,000 bus stops.
Yeah,
that's absolutely true.
Yeah, it's maintenance and operation costs. I mean, that was, again, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but every time I'm in Oak Cliff in Dallas, I see our streetcar. That was our streetcar. We were awarded funding, I think, against 50 cities, and we won the funding, and then we gave it back. So the next place was Oak Cliff. They got it. It's a really nice streetcar, and it was supposed to run from downtown to the cultural district, and then from the stockyards to Magnolia in the hospital district. It's kind of a cool thing to have.
MARTA, I think.
Right. Kind of a cool thing to have, like, weather like this.
Right.
When there's
well, if you have if you're working on a project, just transit, we all are maybe painfully aware of the deficits there. But what are I guess another way to ask this is, what are some key elements of design that you want to incorporate when you're creating something, especially for public usage? What are kind of the basic key elements that you would consider? And when you're designing, what kind of process do you go through to be sure that you're considering all the different people who might use this space? For instance, as you were speaking to earlier at Mockingbird Lane, where you might contact the homeowners, but not the actual transit rider. So what process do you go through to consider your elements of design as well as who will actually be using it?
Well, I mean, who is your client? Is a client, if it's a government, then you're seeking public input. It's a private client, yeah, they're the ones that kind of drive things. So I would say the fundamental things, I mean, accessibility is now codified in law, in both the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is not a building code, it is a federal civil rights legislation. And that has been codified into a law in Texas called the Texas Accessibility Standards, which is effectively a building code. And then the International Building Code, which most states follow, does have an accessibility section as well. So the accessibility aspect of it happens generally just by law and by building permit and review, which is a good thing because, you know, many private builders would not install handicap toilets if they weren't forced to. I mean, just simple fact. So that's important. I guess if you're talking about this project, I would say ergonomics, other than shade. If you're doing benches, you know, how do you provide ergonomics? Are they comfortable? How do people sit? Is there a definition of personal space for each person? You know, sadly, how enduring are they? Skateboarders, you know, people carving their initials, taggers.
Sounds like an activated and used community space to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's an investment. It has, I mean, if you're going to spend the public money, I think it's incumbent upon us to do things that are enduring.
And I was learning about ADA accessibility, and it's a requirement and it's codified into law, but it's also only one form of accessibility in terms of the physical built environment. There's all these other levels to that. And I don't know if I've got to fact check my source, but like small private businesses, if they're under a certain size and they don't serve the public, then they don't have to adhere to the same rules for accessibility, if I understand correctly. Which that's not necessarily related to the transit conversation because this is obviously a public project, but just in terms of considering accessibility in the design process, if it weren't codified into law, what would that look like? How would you consider who's using that space?
I think kind of an interest in the way I like to think about things. A bus stop is useless on its own, right? If there's just a bus stop in the middle of nowhere, nobody would ride it. And so making sure that any facility you're building makes sense in its context is really important for accessibility. And you see this in weird ways where nobody's doing any one thing against code, but because the city didn't talk to the transit agency, you'll have, you know, bus stops that have a beautiful wheelchair ramp that then leads off into an island that you can't get off of the side. You know, it's, you know, where are people going, right? Are you making them go, you know, all the way around a huge building when they're trying to get to this other place? Making sure that things are stitched together in a way that makes sense holistically, I think is really important. It's really easy to get myopic and code blind and say, well, I followed the code. So we're done. And I'm paying for my part and the city will take care of theirs and the fire department will make their complaints and whatever. But that's a challenge to overcome. That's not necessarily code related.
I think, bicycle commuters, you know, having the bike racks on buses is a big plus, obviously, making it easy for people to then use their bicycles maybe for the last mile, as they call it. Safety, you know, always an issue for the LGBTQ community. Public safety, do people feel safe in a space? Do they feel protected? there's a lot of issues there. And it's a lot of weight to put on a bench at a bus stop.
Hopefully it can bear the load.
I mean, in terms of just what it can do, what it can't do, at its most simple, it's it's just like I said, it's just a way of respecting people and saying, we want to make it easier for you.
You want to start a war on Nextdoor, telling them you're taking away a parking spot and putting in a street light. See what happens.
Oh yeah. No doubt about it.
This has been really great.
One of the things that was mentioned, especially in terms of community outreach, is how important trust is, right? And it seems like generally, and especially probably more so, there's probably quite a bit of, there's a big lack of that, I think, between the community and kind of the agencies that are making these decisions for them. I know, Greg, that AIA has been pretty vocal about the discrepancies in diversity, so minority or women architects or designers in these fields. In terms of these decision makers and these designers and planners and engineers, how much do you see those communities not looking like the communities that they're designing for being a barrier to that?
Well, it's a significant issue that the AIA, which represents maybe roughly half of registered architects, licensed architects in the United States. Not all architects are part, but it's been the focus before, Black Lives Matter. It's been an enduring focus and a very frustrating one. Women have made tremendous strides in our profession, I'm proud to say. Right now, last time, I think about 55% of architecture school students are women. And it's slow, but if you look at the principals in firms, you see the wave moving up. It's too slow. But my firm in the last 11 years probably hired 2 males. It's because we hire the best people and they happen to be women. So it's a great profession for women. The mommy track is a problem, childcare is a problem, and it does derail, like in every other job, women, but it's really good. And the Texas Society of Architects has had a number of women presidents, one right now. Fort Worth AIA has a woman president. National AIA has quite a few. So they're catching up there. In terms of Black representation, it's abysmal. I believe it's about 3%, when obviously it should be at least 13 to be representative. And it is a problem. And we as a profession recognize that we're in danger as a profession if we don't look like the people we serve. And but I could talk about this for hours, but role models are incredibly important. And there's been some incredibly important African American architects that have been neglected that are now recognized. But we see things like David Adige, who designed the African American Smithsonian Museum. Now, he's actually of Ghanaian heritage and he's from England. But I think it's very important for kids to see that and say, you know what, I can be that, because otherwise, they don't have that role model. So the profession is working. But it's because of the educational requirements to become licensed, it has to start, early in the educational process to increase representation. It doesn't do any good to go out and look for people that are college graduates, unless, of course, they want to go to graduate school. So it's frustrating, but it's been It's getting better, but just not fast enough.
Yeah, I could certainly echo all that, but I think from a different approach, you know, the public sector it's not enough to just go, you know, put things up to a sense where you can look at, you know, take any company and look at the company's composition and compare it to the demographics of their place they're working. If they're equal, your job is done. There's already such a huge debt that, you know, our built society owes to the people whose backs it was built on. You know, I can draw you a map of every freeway through America and show you which houses were torn down. I can, you know, draw a Sankey diagram of every federal housing program, every, you know, benefits and means tested program. And so to ask of a community to trust an agency or an entity that, you know, not only has ignored it, but has actively destroyed its institutions is just a huge, huge uphill battle. And I don't have an easy answer for that. And I, you know, frankly, I think my voice is probably overrepresented anyway, but just acknowledging that, like, you know, you're never going to get your gold star. And that, you know, we're kind of, yeah, I mean, this is to me one of the ways that I think, you know, reparations as they're, you know, talked about in America, you know, this is one of the avenues that we can engage in that. And I think it's a blessing that it's available to us, but to think that we're going to fix anything in this lifetime is folly.
Well, I think I agree 100%. And it's really, you know, there's no matter how aware, you know, we try to think we are, I mean, we all have biases in all kinds of ways. And in my children, my previous wife, we were divorced, and my ex moved to Frisco, Texas, and which, you know, I was so, you know, like, oh God, you're moving, you know, it's like, oh boy, you know, no diversity and just, you know, a suburb, and oh God. I remember going to her high school graduation, Frisco High School, and I was shocked at the diversity. Shocked. And it was, you know, I was wrong. Not saying it's a progressive place. I don't know enough about it. But my point is that it's also a class-based issue, because the African-American, there was a fairly significant African-American represented, or Black in that group, a lot of East Asian. And why? Because all these corporate headquarters are there. And most of these kids, I mean, obviously they have the barriers of race and color, but they're from generally pretty well-off families, middle class and upward. And I think we, as Scott mentioned, you know, redlining, the way the legislature funds public schools. You know, everybody doesn't have a right to the same funding. You know, if you're in a wealthy district, you get more money. And so we're like repeating a cycle that just, you know, has proven to institutionalize people that are disadvantaged through no fault of their own. And we have to do something about it. And reparate, whatever you want to call it, it's like, just make it right. Because it's our future of a country. You know, we need educated people, educated workforce. We have to give opportunity. And, you know, the United States has dropped so far down on social mobility ratings. You know, we used to think of, you know, Europe, oh, well, you know, it's no social mobility there. Well, we're way below Europe on social mobility. And we all love these stories of the kids that grow up in the projects or the shack and go on to become a CEO or whatever. That's increasingly less likely in this country because
there's a Harvard study that talks about how public transportation is actually one of the #1 indicators of social mobility, is the amount of time that it takes you to commute. Yeah. I used to commute on public transportation from Fort Worth, from the Magnolia area, what is that, the medical district, to Denton to go to school. And that commute took me 3 hours each way. I was driving to Denton the other day and there was a bus running and I was like, yeah, this is a young bus. It wasn't here when I was going.
Oh, God.
But it was that experience profoundly changed my life. It was a very, very difficult time in my life that I remember as being perpetually beaten down, basically, and exhausted. Because if I missed the last bus and the buses wouldn't run on time, then I would get stuck either in Denton or in Dallas. That last TRE train, I had to time everything just right. And if I missed it, then I was out of luck, or I was going to have to call in a huge favor for somebody to brave the I-35 traffic to come for me. So I wasn't sure, Dee, if you had another, did you have another question?
One more question, and it's about owners, right? Because we ask a lot of questions, and I think what Greg said is that it really depends on, who the owner is, and in particular with public projects. Are there any public projects that either Scott or Greg have worked in that have had a really, really great model for community engagement from the outset, or where the community or the intended public that was to be serviced had a great role as a stakeholder in this?
A lot of the public art projects that I worked on, those weren't my projects per se, but just being on the commission, had tremendous community engagement. Some of the public, I've done a rec center in Dallas. I've done 3 public libraries around the state, going back years. Public libraries tended to have tremendous interest from the public. But again, it's often a more affluent community. I don't have maybe one shining example. Our project in Macon, it was called the Macon Agri-Hood, and they had received a federal grant to hire us to do this. And we produced a beautiful report, and the project died. The community leader who was heading it up, and more power to him, got a job in Denver as an assistant to the mayor. And, he's a brilliant young man. I think it was like meeting young Barack Obama. I mean, I fully expect him to be a senator someday. This kid was amazing. And so, I mean, unfortunately, that project died. But, that community, I don't know. I have a tendency to go off. But the highway exit to go to downtown Macon used to go right through this community. And the city actually closed a bridge so that you couldn't go that way to get downtown. So you didn't have to drive through that community on your way to downtown. And that goes back, Scott probably has 10 million stories like that. I mean, it was like, not only are we not going to help you, like, we want you out of sight and out of mind, because, you're not good enough to welcome people to our city. It was shocking. I-35 in Dallas, I mean, that's well documented, particularly South Dallas. It went through all the redlining areas, just straight through. Urban renewal, I mean, same thing. Just often with the best of intentions. But anyway, there's a great, I don't know if you've ever seen the film. It's called the Pruitt-Igoe myth. The Pruitt-Igoe is the infamous housing project in St. Louis that was demolished because it was so inhumane. It's like the poster child for, and there's a really good documentary on that about how when it was built, it was like a nirvana for the people that lived there. And it was basically there's a lot of compromises in the architecture, but it really came down to the management, and they destroyed the community that it was served to that it was built to serve. And I think, all of us who want, to do things that consider themselves to be progressives, boy, it's a lot of follow through, and it can be very discouraging.
I would just echo and from what I said earlier about, for me as someone who works as a consultant and so is usually 2 or 3 layers away from the public, making sure that there is a person whose job it is to know the community and make sure that those champions are identified, that they're working with all the community groups, not just one community group, but making sure that all voices are being proactively sought out. For me, the projects that feels like it is a real and true and vital part of it are the ones where significant budget is devoted to community engagement, where there is a firm that is locally based, that has those relationships with the business community. Faith leaders tend to be huge resource. Community centers, community groups, elected officials. We see a lot of cities have advisory boards that have local folks on them, and just really making sure that you're not, throwing one horseshoe at the ring and calling it a day. That you're really out there. Don't make some tortured metaphor about it, but that you've got a lot of different avenues to engage the community through. And it's really easy to ignore because a lot of times it's Parks and Recreation was a documentary. Those meetings are stressful. So,
yeah.
You got to want to do it.
Yeah. Now the rec center, this was many years ago in the late 80s, I did in Dallas at Exall Park. There was a community nearby that was sort of an in-town new community. And they came to the public meetings and demanded that there be no basketball courts at the rec center. Well, what is that code word for? They were just vociferous that you can't put basketball courts here. And, you see it seems like, boy, that's crazy. But, you go to enough of these public meetings, you see things. Nobody comes out and says what they're thinking. But
if you're lucky.
After the last few years, that seems to have changed. It's true. People seem to be proud to say those things nowadays. But, it's, I don't know, there's a young woman architect in Chicago who spoke at the Texas Society of Architects, and she does some amazing public work. And she described herself as a pissed off optimist. And I love that. And I've adopted that. It's like, I'm optimistic, but I'm pretty ticked off. I think we have to be optimistic. We have to look forward. It's a crooked line, but we have to keep moving in the right direction.
Well, I consider us lucky for having you both here and speaking with us on our panel. Thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to keeping you updated on our project and future collaborations.
All right, thank you all so much for that great presentation. We are now in the Q&A portion of the meeting. So I'm just going to give everyone a moment. Feel free to raise your hand, or you can write a question in the Q&A section.
I had a couple other questions come up when I was listening. One thing that and I'm not sure if Raquel is able to if your microphone is working, Raquel. But in terms of this project, I was just thinking of or wondering if you had any recommendations for when we were talking about those key elements, maybe some material, like what kind of materials you might recommend for keeping in mind that this is a temporary project, but I don't know if you have any kind of, just from being in the industry, any material recommendations that some of our participants might use. I was hoping to hear from Raquel because she has a lot of experience with a lot of really big projects. She's worked with DART and she's an engineer as well. So bringing a different perspective to the conversation. But Raquel, we still can't hear you.
Yeah, sadly, I think that Raquel's maybe having some technical difficulties, but maybe we can reach out to you, Raquel, after this presentation and get some answers there. Scott, Greg, do y'all have any thoughts about materials?
None.
Well, I would say, I mean, cost is an issue, durability. If it's not physically attached to the ground, it's probably not concrete. Steel and wood are the two major elements that you would expect.
I see another question here from Tammy Melody Gomez about the term extreme low density in urban areas. Can we break this term down? And what did you, I think, Greg, you used that term talking about the DFW Metroplex and the extreme low density as an urban area.
Right. The metropolitan areas can be ranked by the number of people that live per square mile. If you look at it as a metro area, counterintuitively, the densest large city is Los Angeles, which is sort of the poster child for sprawl, but it has sort of a consistent density across a large area. Obviously, Manhattan, which is not its own statistical area, but it has incredibly high people per square foot. So DFW is a very low density place in terms of large cities. What's DFW now, number 6, I think, in the country. But it's still pretty low density, a lot of land, things are spread out.
I think just to shed some light on technical terms there, urbanized area is a federal definition of a region that applies to some funding and some other things, and it's analogous in a lot of ways to metropolitan area. Not to be confused with urban area, with urban just kind of being a vernacular term meaning, you know, denser.
Another question that I had was talking about, you know, we talked, or Scott, you mentioned how important it is to have champions of these projects in order to move community-based initiatives up a priority list with the city, for instance. And so especially for groups that have been systematically disempowered, do you have any tips besides, you know, having a champion and someone who's like a community liaison? What are some strategies to move a project up a list? I mean, have you found there's always petitions circulating, for instance, or people will encourage, you know, email your elected officials. Do you have any recommendations on strategies to move projects up a list?
Sure. You know, I don't think any of those things you listed off are bad approaches. I think Greg actually mentioned this last time, is that, you know, sometimes, you know, there's kind of an hierarchy of communication, and emails are great, phone calls are better, face-to-face time is even better. And so, you know, it's not out of line to ask for that face-to-face time with somebody who ostensibly represents your community, especially when you're talking about, you know, city council members. And, you know, a little bit of research about what the entities actually are. It's, if you're not really plugged into your community or familiar with what admittedly is a pretty, Byzantine set of organizations, you might find that the person with the power doesn't work at the city, they might work at the transit agency, or if they are in the city, they might not work, in the community involvement department, it might be somebody in public works. And so those are things that, spending some time with, sometimes it's just the internet and trying to figure out where those levers of power are, that can pay off a lot, and trying to find a champion, trying to find somebody who actually has, the power to make those changes that you'd like to see in your community.
I'm going to speak up for our silent partner, Raquel, who's writing answers in the chat here. And she just adds that one of the best ways to move a project up a list is to contact your city council person and other politicians.
And I would take that a step further and you get the council members that you want elected. There's some council members who are really only focused on certain parts of their communities, and others who do a great job of representing everybody. And so that can, the local politicians have a lot of power to change things at the local level. So.
One last question that I have is, spending a lot of time on the internet is a great way to learn. I've learned so much in the last 4 years about what TOD is. There's all these acronyms, right? Transit-oriented development. And as I develop myself to hopefully be a champion for projects and such, are there any other resources to kind of learning those technicalities that empower someone to become, a champion, and more of just, there's the work of like showing up and organizing people, but then to be able to have, the conversations and not be dismissed as ignorant from, professionals. Are there any other resources to I see a comment from Raquel that says the lingo is important to know, as people in the industry use them on a daily basis. So are there any other tools to kind of develop that vocabulary?
Yeah. Well, aside from, going to school for it, I think it's one of those things that takes time to learn the language. And it's one of those things that understanding when the language is being used to communicate precisely and when it's used to obscure processes that are going on. And there's a difference between the two. And so a lot of that is doing your research, and maybe that's a little bit of a circular argument, but understanding that your lack of knowledge isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes that keeps you honest a little bit. And just because you don't know what TOD stands for doesn't mean that you don't have a vested interest in, being able to get on a bus every day.
Yeah, I don't have any titles per se I could quote. There's a tremendous number of organizations, all with their own acronyms, like the Urban Land Institute, AICP, American Institute of City Planners. There's lots of people that you can research that do have position papers or information about initiatives. But I would agree with Scott. Don't sell yourself short. It's your community. If you want to get involved, and don't be intimidated.
And Raquel says down here that the lingo, is important to know as the people in the industry use them on a daily basis, but another source would be the agency building the project. And so if there's something that's unclear to you, reaching out to the agency to get more information is great, and that you should never shy away from talking just because of the lingo. The agency building the facility also has citizens commitment, so you can attend to, or citizens committees, so you can attend to learn more about the project. I'm also going to take a moment to do a little commercial for the Tarrant Transit Alliance. Every single year we have a project called the Transit Academy, and that is set up to really teach citizens about the ins and outs of the transit industry, for planners, architects, as well as everyday folks. So you can learn some of that lingo. You can learn about some of the projects that are going on. You can learn what you can do to help change what transit looks like in your community. And so we are actually in the middle of our Transit Academy right now, and another one will start up at the beginning of next year. So if you're interested in learning more, I recommend signing up for our newsletter. We'll send you information about it. And one more thing I was noticing, Raquel was answering our questions about the materials of the actual design. She shared that she believes that there should be a shelter, not just a bench, and that the shelter should be clear, see-through, and it shouldn't be able to shatter or easily break. And so that's really important to consider, that the people that are sitting there are able to actually see what's going on, and that the bus driver is able to see that there are people waiting there. And she also says that it's important to consider the customer using the system and the needs for them to stay dry during the different types of weather, which is absolutely one of the main reasons why we are doing this project, to provide that sort of respite for the citizens of Glen Park and hopefully others across Fort Worth and beyond. Okay, folks, so I think that is it. We do have a recording about how to actually sign up for this design process that we will post on our website. We shared that during the first workshop, and it's a recycled recycled recording, and so I'm not going to do it again here. Instead, what I'm going to do is encourage you to go to our website, tarranttransitalliance.org, and from there you'll be able to see one of the first sliders is all about the urban design competition. From there, there's links to this workshop, as well as the other two that we had at the beginning of, or in the middle of last week and yesterday. So go there, you can learn more about the neighbor's perspective, as well as perspectives of design justice. You can learn more about the design build industry. So some really great topics that you can dig into. Would like to remind you that registration for this competition closes on Monday. Now registration is just for you to sign up your team. We just want to know who all will be participating, so you don't need to have your shelter design ready to go by that time. Those designs will be due March 15th. So a little bit of time between registration and the actual due date. I'm also going to take an opportunity just to say that on March 30th, the Tarrant Transit Alliance will be having a mayoral candidates forum on Zoom, and as well as broadcasted on Facebook Live, where we will be interviewing all of the City of Fort Worth mayoral candidates about their views of public transportation. So mark your calendar, March 30th, 6 p.m. and check it out. Finally, I want to thank all of our panelists for taking some time today out of their Saturday to have a conversation with us, answer some questions. Anything else you want to add, Sadie?
I just saw a comment from Tammy about a transit equity webinar coming up as well. If you're interested in diving deeper into this topic, I mean, we really only brushed the surface. We could talk about it on and on. So I don't know if that is visible to everyone or a way to share that link, but it's March the 9th. March the 9th at 4 p.m. A Learning Lab Transit Equity webinar.
All right, with that, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.